Oh, it's pouring outside now. Good morning, church family, and welcome to the Fullerton Seventh-day Adventist Church. Okay. That's called a dress rehearsal. It is really pouring out. Good morning, church family, and welcome to the Fullerton Seventh-day Adventist Church. My name is Richard Cassel, and I'll be leading the discussion this morning. And it's nice to have those that are here and those that are watching online. We hope you receive a blessing from watching and observing the study this morning. Before we start, shall we have a word of prayer? Heavenly Father, as we come together this morning to study your word, may the Holy Spirit speak through us. May each and every one of us receive a blessing. May we get a better understanding of what the lesson is trying to tell us, or what it's told us historically and what it's telling us today, and what it means for each and every one of us. Be with us, and grant traveling mercies to those who are on the way, for we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, again, good morning. And we have, it's a two-part lesson we're having this quarter. And it's called, first part is Nations, and the second part is Nations 2. So that's pretty, and there's a lot of material in here and a lot that we can learn from studying the lesson today. And we kind of see how history has a way of repeating itself over and over and over again. And everything that we try to do as humans doesn't work. It's only through the power of God, when we let God lead, that we are successful, and the church is successful, and there's growth. And this is kind of what the lesson is pointing out today. So we're going to be studying basically over kind of about three books, Genesis, Daniel, and Revelation. And I don't know where I read it, if I read it in the lesson or somebody said it or something, but it made an interesting statement that I'd never thought about. It says that the book of Revelation is in some ways the book of Genesis in reverse. And it's an interesting statement. It's the book of Genesis in reverse. And the reason is, when you think about it, how did the Adam and Eve, when they entered the planet, how was it?
Perfect.
Perfect. Yeah. They entered a perfect planet. Everything was perfect. Nothing could be improved over that. It was great. And then we see when sin entered, when decisions were made, that it went downhill from there, and it's continued to go downhill. You keep wondering, how much lower can it go? But I think we're approaching rock bottom. And then Revelation is the opposite, because Revelation does what? It presents the solution. So it brings us back to this perfect world that we had when Adam and Eve were on the planet. And now we're going to go back there again at the end of time. So we know by studying from Genesis, God had a plan for us. He wanted each of us to be happy and love. He loved us. He loved us more than we can imagine. And it started with him. But what happened is that sin. And what preempted sin? It says the people fell into temptation of choosing their own plan. And any time that we try to circumvent God, when we think our plan is better, there's going to be repercussions. It's not going to go well. And it reminds me of, and we'll study as we see what happens when they ask for a king, and some of the lessons that we have today. But the people fell into temptation of choosing their own plan over God. So the next two chapters, the next two lesson studies are going to talk about how people failed to find the right path. But as we see, God always provides a way. So no matter how far we fall, no matter how bad things get, God has got a plan. But again, what we know from studying the lesson that we have freedom of choice. We have the right to make our own decisions. But again, God guides us, but God doesn't do what? Doesn't force us, does not force us to make a decision. When we get to the book of Revelation, we'll find out that it shows us God's plans for a fallen world. You read about it. I'd like to read what is brought up in the lesson this morning. It says, one of the key issues in both Daniel and Revelation is worldly government, a succession of human attempts to control a planet that rightfully belongs to God, who will, once this horrible episode of sin and rebellion is forever, ultimately will order. So what do we see over the history as we go through the Bible and study the Bible over and over and over again? How well has self-government worked out for the economy? I mean, go ahead.
Not very well.
not very well. You know, whenever we think we know something better than God, it usually doesn't work out well, you know. But again, we seem to go back and over and over and over. We'll have a revival and then it goes down. It goes up, goes down. But we know ultimately this will all come to an end, that God will show us and we will know what is right. The memory verse says, then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is everlasting, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom, the one which shall not be destroyed. So what the memory verse tells us is we're going to experience this until the very end of time. Nothing is going to really improve that much. And it seems like, as we've talked about, it seems like it continues to get a little worse, and a little worse. Sunday's lesson talks about Nimrod and Nineveh. Now, a little background. Nimrod was the great-grandson of Noah and the son of Cush. And was he good or was he bad?
Yeah. Well, he was an evil person.
Okay, he was an evil person, you know. But let's read what it says in Genesis 10, 8 through 12. Could you read that, Roger, when you get a chance? Yeah. And see what it has to say. Because when I first read this, it sounds pretty good to me. But again, let's look at it a little deeper and see what the meaning of this is. Genesis 10, 8 through 12.
Genesis.
Is it not working? Okay.
Genesis 8.
10.
Genesis 10. 8 to what?
8 to 12.
8 to 12. Now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land he went forth into Assyria, and built Nineveh, and Rehoboth, and Cassel.
Okay, thank you. So just when we read the eighth verse 9, it says, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That sounds like to me it sounds good, at least on first reading. And it says, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord. So, but what was Nimrod? I mean, at this point in time, what was he showing? He was a rebellious spirit. You know, he was rebelling. He was rebelling. And again, turns out, as we'll see, he was a very evil king, which we've seen so many of them. Now it talks about Nimrod and Nineveh. Nineveh, a city in Assyria that was built by Nimrod, had great wealth, great power, and prestige. And the Assyrians, what were the Assyrians known for? Were they good people?
No. They were known to be conquerors, and of course they take on slaves, and they were quite destructive.
And also very cruel. And idolaters. I mean, if you read some of the stories, I mean, it's amazing how much pain they would just try to inflict, how cruel they were, and it just shows you how degenerate the world was becoming at that time, because if they could inflict more pain, they would. And then we know for a short time, God called somebody to talk to him. And we know we've studied in previous lessons, is he selected Jonah and asked Jonah to go there. And was Jonah happy about that? Was Jonah happy about coming to Nineveh? Very, 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 very unhappy. Very unhappy. And he was able to get the people to reform, which I thought was interesting. When you look at that, because of all the people that you would think that would come back to God, they did it. And yet we know later on things changed again as history continued on. But even though many times God has the solution, there's a problem. And the problem is that we need to surrender to him. We cannot do it on our own. And when we begin to feel, as we study, that we can do it on our own, then we fall into this trouble. We fall into this nightmare of things. And so we see that it continues on. And when we talk about man-made solutions, it says, a new heaven and a new earth, we're told in Revelation 21:1 will be here. But others, however, worked on man-made solutions to our newfound problems, and we see the birth of city-states and attempt to create an easier life and perhaps to recapture what was lost in Eden. Then they erected the Tower of Babel. What was the purpose of that? Does anyone have an idea why they constructed this Tower of Babel? I've heard that it's to try to reach up to God, to protect the people from another flood, whatever. But again, it was all about man-made solutions. It was all about man's solutions, you know. They wanted to be like God, yeah.
Well, again, they mistrusted God.
Yeah.
You know, they want to make sure that should there be another flood, even though the Lord said there won't be a flood that will destroy the whole earth, just in case, just in case, to be safe, they decide to build a tower so that they will not be destroyed by a flood.
Right, yeah. And what was the result of the Tower of Babel? What?
Languages were mixed up, so to speak.
Yeah, God came down, and that's when we had, be so simple in this world today if we had one language, but we got, I guess, hundreds and hundreds of different languages and dialects and things like that, but he confused the people and gave them different languages and stuff like that. So we see that. So again, it says, Nimrod, he became a mighty warrior, but not in a good way. the beginning of his kingdom, Babylon, Erech, all of these things were the start of the downfall. Some have read about Nimrod and concluded that he was a noble hero, much like the conquering heroes of pagan mythology. But when the Bible describes him as a mighty one on earth, a mighty hunter before the Lord, it is not a compliment. Nimrod is great in his own estimate, and he stands before the Lord in the sense that he defies God. What we see in these texts is a spreading of the rebellion against God, a rebellion that will exist ultimately, and rebellion will be until it's forever eradicated. You know, it asks a question at the bottom of the page I thought was kind of interesting. It says, why is the sin of rebellion against God more subtle than we might realize? How can we protect ourselves against this very human trait? You know, sometimes it starts out little, you know, like if we're going to do something wrong, we may just kind of do a little thing, you know, and then it kind of multiplies. You know, we begin to think maybe we can do it better on our own. Do we really need God? Is that really what God intended for us? You know, I kind of think this would work better. We're trying to take it upon ourselves to, for a lack of a better term, outsmart God. You know, I really know how that works. And all right, I mean it is, you know. But we wanted to remember that once we lose our focus, once we walk away, we're just the start of our troubles. Monday's lesson talks about Abraham's call. Now, when you think about Abraham, you know, God calls Abraham to somewhere special. And what did he do? He calls him to do what? It was something special. He says, I want you to leave your home. Go into a strange country and establish a human kingdom that would be different. And that was the point, to establish a human kingdom that would be different. Can you imagine if you were Abraham to go tell your wife, honey, we're going to move. I'm not sure, but pack up, we're going. You know, Lot, we'll take what we have and go. What are we going to do there? Well, I'm not 100% sure, but I trust God. And it wasn't a short trip. They took a long trip to a foreign country and to start it without anything. Now, what was the purpose? What was God calling Abraham to do? What was if you had to put it in one sentence, what was the purpose of this nation that Abraham was going to establish? You know, it was to be a nation that would stand in contrast to the other nations. So it was to be separate. It was to be something different. You know, I think sometimes we think about that. How many of us want to stand out? You know, how many of us want to be different? You know, do you want to go into a group, like a meeting with a lot of people, and be the oddball? You know, sometimes, you know, we want to blend in, and I'm not saying be different in a way that antagonizes people or anything like that, but they should be able to see something different in us, and that's what God's plan for Abraham was, to establish a nation that would be different, that would have an influence on other countries. God intended to use Abraham to establish a nation that would stand in contrast to human kingdoms. They were not to have a king other than God himself. And we're going to talk about the king a little later, you know, because that's a key point. They were not to have a king other than God himself. The people were to show that what would happen if the human race returned to their Creator. Israel was established to be a blessing to all families on earth, Genesis 12:3. God had poured out upon the Israelites light and privileges that had not been even seen in the world, perhaps since before the flood. Okay, let's. So it was to be something different, something to stand out, and I'm sure all of us have been in that situation where we go somewhere and we feel uncomfortable. I've been to functions. And when there's a certain norm that the people are doing and you don't do it, you might feel uncomfortable. But that was God's intention, That was his intention, that we should be someone different. We should be someone positive, and we should show this in a positive light. Can I have somebody read Deuteronomy 4, 5 through 9.
Deuteronomy 4, 5 to 9. But you who held fast to the Lord, your God, are alive today, and every one of you. See, I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do thus in the land where you are entering to possess it. So keep them and do them, for that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the people, who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God, whenever we call on him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law, which I am setting before you? Only give heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently, so that you do not forget the things which your eyes have seen, and they do not depart from your heart, all the days of your life, but make them known to your sons and your grandsons.
Okay, thank you. So it says, two things I got out of that. What kind of said to me is, number one, they were to be an example. But was it one person who was to be an example?
The whole nation.
The whole nation, the entire nation. Not a single person. A single person can be a spark. They can have a spark for a movement. In this case, it was God. But he chose Abraham to build, to start, and to build this up into a. But again, a single person can't do it. I remember one time I was chairman of the school board, and one of the principals we were talking about a work bee and some other stuff, and he made the point. He says, many hands make the work light, and you can accomplish much more. And I always remember that. Many hands make the work light, and you can accomplish much more. And that's very true, It says, you've heard the expression, you need a village to raise a child. And so for evangelism, isn't it kind of the same way? You need more than one person, to be effective. It reminds me of different businesses and stuff, They start out, but without help, without things like that, they can't grow. But again, what do we see? Abraham had the call. It says, this was not a single witness bearing a single witness in a community. This was an entire nation that by working together and in cooperation with God could exhibit the glory. Two key points that kind of I got out of that. Again, we talked about it wasn't a single person. It wasn't a single person, but it was an entire nation. And what was it doing? It was working in cooperation with God. Only then could they exhibit the glory of God. Only then. Surely this great nation is wise and understanding, Deuteronomy 4:6. However wonderful the truths given to the people, their failure to live up to them, to obey them, would bring curses instead of blessings and death instead of life. How many times in history have we seen where we've wanted something only to find out what? not what we need, you know. God knows, and it reminds me, unless we listen to what he has to say, we're not gonna. It's not gonna work. Not gonna work. Tuesday's lesson talks about given what you ask for. Given what you ask for. What were they asking for in Tuesday?
To have a king just like the other nations.
Yeah, to have a king. And what had God told them? What was God's plan for Israel?
They were to be different.
They were to be different, yeah.
Yes.
Who was their king?
The Lord.
The Lord, yeah. But again, why? You know, they said, well, they wanted to do, again, going back to their own way. You know, they wanted to have a king, and we'll read a little bit about this and see why was it that they were so intent on having a king. And if we look at 2 Samuel, 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 18. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all other nations. So we know Samuel's getting old, of course. What about his kids?
Well, they didn't follow the Lord.
They didn't follow the Lord. Mm-hmm. So logically, they would not be good. And the people were, that was a correct observation. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But Samuel wasn't a king. Mm-hmm. He was just following God's plan. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. So one of the things we find, you know, that sometimes when we ask for something, God will reluctantly give it to us. And we have to be careful. If it's not in our best interests, he's not going to refuse us. But he'll let you know the consequences. And we'll see as we read on, there are consequences. Have you ever wanted something really bad, and then after you got it, you said, oh, why in the world did I do that? Reminds me like when I was young, I wanted a nice car. Could I afford it? No. Did it turn out to be a curse? Yes, you know, because it went bye-bye. But anyway, so God knows what was right for the people, you know. And so but what the people were asking for, it displeased Samuel. He knew it was wrong. Samuel knew it was wrong. But they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. Now, he didn't pray for their will to be done, but he prayed for God's will to be done. He prayed for help us. You know, we need help. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people and all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So he told them, you know, give them what they want. Give them what they want, you know. They want a king, give them a king. We know it's not good for them, we've told them. And yet, it was a rejection of God that they wanted a king. According to all the works they have done since the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto today, wherewith they have forsaken me, and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. So it was a rejection. Samuel thought they were rejecting him, but they were rejecting him, but it wasn't just Samuel, they were rejecting God. Rejecting God. According to all the works Verse 8 again. According to all the works which they have done since that day I brought them out of Egypt, even unto today, where they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. Now therefore hearken unto the voice, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. So when he told them what they were going to get, he was nice enough to tell them the results, you know. You want a king? Okay, you can have a king. I'm not going to deny you a king. But let's do a little study on this. Let's look. And it says, and he said, this will be manner of the king that shall reign over you. So you're going to give him a king, going to reign over him. He will take all your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. So what is that? That's like conscription or inscription, whatever you call it.
Yeah.
He was going to take them.
Drafted.
Drafted, that's what I was looking for. He was going to put them to work. They were going to work for the king. And he shall appoint captains over thousands and captains over 50s, and he will set them to ear to his ground, and to reap the harvest, and to make instruments of war and instruments of chariots. So not only was he going to take your children, conscript them, but now what is he going to do? They were going to become his soldiers. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. Do we see that in other parts of the world today? You know, if you look around the world today and see some of the many wealthiest nations, and I'm including the United States in that, you see the very cream of the crop, the very top the 1%ers, you know, the 1%ers. Remember, I went to a meeting one time, a financial meeting with a group, and I remember one guy leaning over to the other guy and saying, "Hey, we're the 1%ers." You know, he goes like that, and I'm thinking, wow, you know, how our priorities are missed. You know, how far off we've come. You know, and again, I don't want to get political, but what do we see today happening in the United States? Is it becoming more? They're spreading the wealth out? Yeah. No, I don't think so. It's being more and more consecrated at the top. And it goes on. And he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, and even the best of them, and give them to his servant. You know, that's kind of like taxation, you know, redistributing the wealth, but it's not going down, it's going up. And he will take 1/10 of your seed and of your vineyards and give them to his officers and to his servants. And we see that, again, I'm not trying to be political or anything, but it goes to my mind all the time. I look at President Trump, how he allocates his key positions. Who does he give them to? Definitely not the most qualified. Definitely not the most. To his friends, you know. You know, all those people that overthrew the Capitol. They did horrible things, and they should have been punished. There should have been consequences, but they were pardoned, and so many people are doing that. So again, we see different things going, not just here, we see it in Russia, we see it throughout the whole world, all these different countries. The very cream have everything and that not, and they take. So he was telling the people, look, this is what's going to happen, but it's your choice. And he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take 1/10 of your seed and 1/10 of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. Now, for a government, we're told in the Bible that we should pay our taxes. You know, we're to render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God what is God. But this wasn't unto God. This was under him. This was going back to the king. And he will take your menservants and your maidservants and your godliest young men and asses and put them to work. He will take a tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which you shall have chosen, and the Lord will not hear you. And I think that last verse in verse 18, it says, and ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which you have chosen, you, and the Lord will not hear you. There's consequences. There's always consequences of our actions. And we need to remember that. But God allowed the people to make their choice. God allowed them to have a king. Could somebody read Deuteronomy? Let me find it. Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20. Deuteronomy 17 through 40.
When you come to the land which the Lord your God has given you, and possess it, and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren, you shall set a king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, from the one before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of his law and statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment, to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel.
Thank you. You know, as you read that, the structure, I was listening to one commentator say, it's kind of like the way the United States is set up. You know, we have a president, you know, we have rules, we have the Constitution, we have all of these different things. But the only difference is, in this, God would allow who the king would be, had to be a natural born citizenship. So a lot of this stuff follows the Constitution of the United States as far as rules and regulations. And notice that God did not say, I will give them a king, but rather his people decide that they want one. God put safeguards in place to protect his people from some of the evils of human government, though as history of the nations and its kings showed, the safeguards were often ignored. Do we see the safeguards today being ignored sometimes?
Yes.
Do we see a breakdown sometimes in the Constitution? You know, we see the President of the United States challenging different things. It's interesting, you know, as we look at that, all the things, as we've often said, you know, history has a way of constantly repeating itself over and over and over again. But God allowed us. Okay.
I think one of the keys in that is that it says, and he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's something where a lot of people that get in power have their own book, their own law that they're trying to enforce. And this is where it says, he shall copy this. You can't just do whatever you want. You have to do what I have said.
So he set guidelines, which is a good point. Yeah, he set guidelines. Yeah. So with this, what could possibly go wrong with the kings? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want I just want to say that In Deuteronomy, the king was supposed to keep the law in his hand, in his heart. Well, our president's supposed to do the same thing. Supposed to keep the law. No one is above the law. But yet, in lessons we've had previously, there are those that look for loopholes. And we should not be looking for loopholes. We should be obeying.
Yeah.
And also when we look at in Jesus' time, what does he say? If you want to be the first, be the servant.
Yeah.
And oftentimes our politicians say they are servants to the public, to the people they serve. But
Yeah.
it seems that once they get in office, they end up serving themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, once it was saying that I was listening to a commentator, and he said, he had some things involved in politics, and he said even if they start out good, by the time they're over, they're corrupt, not corrupt. And I remember many years ago, I had a customer that was on the LA City Council, and they invited me to a meeting, and so I sat around with all the councilmen. I didn't know what I was doing, but I just sat there and listened. Not once, we're there for over an hour, did they bring up what they were doing for the people. It was all about how they could get reelected and what they needed to do to secure their positions. That's all they care about. I mean, I'm sure there's good politicians, don't get me wrong, without a question. But power seems to go to our heads sometimes, and that's what God was warning. He says, it's not going to work. We're always, you say you're looking for loopholes. Currently, we don't even look for loopholes, and sometimes we just say, no, I'm not going to do it, Or Supreme Court said I have to return somebody? No, I don't, or I'm not going to do it, or I have to do this, or I have to turn the plane. No, I'm not going to do it. And so I'm going to fire the chairman of the Federal Reserve. No, I'm not. I mean, I am. No, you're not, So, I mean, there are protections, but sometimes, I think I mentioned it before, but remember one commentator on the first election of the president, Trump, he said, Trump does not want to be president. He wants to be king. I never forgot that. And a good observation.
I think it's interesting when we look at, again, how it ends, of what God said he's going to do or not do.
Yeah.
Of, not listening. And it's interesting how, if you think about it, what they wanted, what Israel wanted was a king, someone to make choices for them, to do things for them. And they had a king that was doing that, but they didn't like what he's doing, God. They didn't like the way he was doing it.
Yeah.
So they wanted someone else. So what they were doing basically is they were transferring the person they worship to the king. And so when you do that, you have assigned yourself to that person, and at some point, you are now beholden to them completely. You gave them all your power. You have put them in that position. You agreed to it. And so now, what is God to do? I mean, he'd have to break the law of what's going on to be able to come in and somehow change you with this. This is, you have given him that power. You don't have a say anymore.
Yeah.
And so it's very important that we watch what we're giving our power to.
Yeah.
Who are we, bowing to? Who are we putting ourselves out to? Because they gain control over us.
Yeah, and that's what God was saying, that they're not rebelling against Samuel, they're rebelling against me, because I'm their king. I'm the one. But the people wanted to make their own decision. They wanted to do their own thing, and so they did it. Wednesday's lesson talks about rulers of the Gentiles. The nation of Israel served to foreshadow the heirs of the church. And that's an interesting thing. Would somebody read Matthew 20, 25 through 28 and see how that impacts? We've talked about the early church. Now we're talking about the New Testament church. And what is God saying here? He's talking to his disciples. So, and let's see do I have a volunteer? If not, I can.
Matthew, can you repeat, please?
20, 25 through 28. Then he had I think that just prior to that, the mother of James
Yes.
and John, were asking to be what?
Who shall sit on the right and left?
Yeah, who shall sit on the right and left of God? And so let's see how Jesus answers this. Go ahead,
Okay.
Roger.
Matthew 20, 25 to 28. But hear this, the 10 became indignant with the two brothers. Oh, sorry. But Jesus called them to himself and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many.
Okay. What was the basic principle Jesus was teaching here? That we're not to be served, but to serve. And that's if the government was formed on that, if we followed that one thing, if we were there to serve, to be kind, to be pleasant, all of these things, follow his rules, it would be a much better world. But we don't do it. You know, we don't do it, you know. And once, like Kyle said, once you give something up, once you give it up, it's hard to get it back, you know. Hard to get it back. So God's model is a model of what? It's a model of service.
It's interesting, we call it government service or military service, all of these things as services, but a lot of times people don't take things as that it's a career, it's a goal, it's prestige. And I think we have to really go back to that idea that this is service. Everything you're doing, if you're doing something for someone else, that is service. That is not meant for you to be in control. In fact, the more you do for more people, it means the more you are doing service for more people. You are serving everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, it says the government is supposed to be a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. So it's supposed to be for the people. You know, that's what the purpose of government is to serve the people. And again, we don't see that. We don't see it. But that's not to be unexpected. So a model of service. Israel asked for a human king, a request that led to the moral downfall of the nation. The kings became progressively more wicked until God allowed the Babylonians to take the people captive as a matter of course correction. That's pretty tough, you know, when all of these people were taken away. They paid the price. It was a result of the life that they led. Also gets into that, talking about, which we're seeing today, it talks about church and state. And I don't want to go into a long discussion on that. But what do we see today? Do we see a separation of church and state? You know, coming closer and closer together, you know. Once the state allows the church to intervene in religious matters, things go from bad to worse. And we see that today, you know. We other religions and stuff, we were founded on the nation on freedom of religions. So if we truly believe that, we should allow people to worship any way they choose, you know. That's their choice. But here, once that happens, when church and state merge, what happens? The rules change a lot, you know. Look at England when I think they came under Roman rule, you know. Then they had the Church of England. They were just as bad, you know.
It's interesting how we just read how God was telling them about the law and to write it, copy it, you know, his law. But that was for his people, his religious people. But he doesn't say that for the Gentiles or anything like that. There's a reason to keep God's law separate from state law. If you try to combine the two, you're basically taking away you're changing God's law to match whatever you're using. Even if you're trying to follow it, you are placing yourself in the place of God. You're saying, I don't like what you're doing. God doesn't like what you're doing, so you're going to do what I say.
Yeah.
And that's the dangerous part of why there's a law for God, and there can be laws for this. But if you combine the two, it's
Yeah. And we can see that so easily. We see that in so many different things, and we're seeing it. We talk about whether there'll be Sunday laws before God comes, Jesus comes again. We don't know. I mean, it says it should, but we don't know. But the point is that we're seeing them getting closer and closer and closer, and as prophecy tells us, we know how it's going to be. We know that there will be a major problem for Christians, persecution that we've never seen. Rulership is domination, but service is service. So, in the 4th century, I'd just like to read this one point. Several major disputes broke out among Christians in the 4th century, and when the church found itself incapable of resolving them, it allowed the emperor to intervene. So, what did they do? They invited the emperor in. Gradually, the Bishop of Rome rose in prominence. Where he had once been senior bishop among equals, the church allowed the state to intervene into religious matters, and once the state had a foothold in the door, things went from bad to worse. And I think that's true. We're never satisfied. Once you get your foot in the door, you want to go further and further and further, And this is what we're seeing now. We're seeing so many different changes in the church. Like Israel of old, many of the darkest chapters in Christian history are the direct result of church compromising with the world. So again, we're to be a different people. I've never been real happy with the word peculiar. That's just my personal thing. But we are to be different. People are to see something different in us. Not that we're to be antagonists. It says we're to be kind, loving, gentle, all of these things. But they should be able to see something different in it, And it's amazing. I'll go out sometimes, and I'll meet somebody or talk to somebody, and I can just feel their spirit. I can feel they're a Christian. I can just the way they talk. Just the way they are. I can see that God is in them.
There's a lot that goes into how we go about, sharing God and worshiping God for ourselves. And when you allow someone else to start making those choices, that's also a human, they can't help but have bias. God is always going to do exactly what is right, what is just. He doesn't sway it either way. So when we go to him for decisions that were tough, as I was saying, and truly rely on him to make it, that's something we can rely on. But when you do that with a person, that person probably is going to like one person a little more than another. They like how you sounded, or they like what you offered.
Yeah.
And as much as they might even try to be just and fair, there's always that little bit, it's my relative, or I think this is a better option. They don't judge just off of logic and love. They do it off of selfishness. So whenever you're mixing God's law that way, the decisions that are being made are not godly decisions. Now they're human decisions done in the name of God.
We have to be careful because many of us have bias. We are a certain bias. We think this person is better than that person. I think that's not for us. I mean, we can observe, but God's the judge. It's up to us to be positive. Where it's appropriate, we can offer suggestions or whatever. But it's ultimately God, and as long as you stick with God's law, it works. Thursday's lesson talks about we're to be a light to the Gentiles, a light to the Gizil. It is a light to the world. Israel was not to condemn the rest of the world, but to be a light. And that's always it. I call it positive in reinforcement. We're to show people a better way. Not just trying to change them for no particular reason, but to show them a better way. It says, however, had the Israelites acted as they should have and done what they had been told to do, the nations would have come to them in peace, seeking to know more about them and their God. Tragically, as a result, the Babylonians' captivity showed those nations came to war instead. So it's a lesson also on how we approach people, how we come in contact with people. You don't come there telling them you're doing this wrong, this wrong, this wrong. You're to be a positive influence. Love, generous, caring. Look at Jesus. How he reacted. You don't see any of that animosity or anything like that, or trying to prove somebody wrong. He would point things out because he was God, but again, he did it in a loving way. He never did it in a bad way.
I think we often fall for the idea of saving others. There's different ways that we approach saving. There can be saving where you actually try to do something for them without actually stepping in and controlling them.
Yeah.
But then there's also saving them where you're like, I just know better. You just need to do what I say, so I'm going to force you to do this.
Yeah.
And we often look at that and go, in a way, it's saving them, so it must be good. Because saving is good, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem is when you're taking away freedom, you might be saving them in one way, but you're stealing their rights.
Mm-hmm.
You're taking things from them, so you're never doing a complete service to them. You are actually taking from them. So if you really need to save someone, it's about actually doing something for them, not trying to get them to do what you want.
Mm-hmm. Look at Jesus' ministry. What do we see there? He was serving. He would heal. He would do all of these different things, not for personal gain, but because he had love and he had compassion on people. And we see that today. Our missionaries and things. They need to take care of the people before they can preach a gospel.
Well, that's like the Pharisees who were sitting there, like, why does he hang out with prostitutes and with tax collectors?
Yeah.
The people that they weren't worth saving.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's amazing how they were able to get to that point where they just had already judged and made this decision that it's not worth risking myself to try and save them. They don't want it anyway.
Yeah. That reminds me of going back to Jonah when he went to Nineveh. I'm sure he felt the same way. He did everything to get out of it he could. But God's got a plan for us, Jesus' perfect example was to demonstrate God to the world. The ultimate purpose for establishing the nation of Israel was the same as God's purpose in establishing the church. Let me read that again. The ultimate purpose for establishing the nation of Israel was the same as God's purpose in establishing the church. He longs to use his people to draw sinners to Christ. So he longs to draw sinners to Christ. God longs to use his people, and we're all his people. He longs to use us to bring people to Christ. We're running a little short on time, but let me read one more, couple quick things before we run out of time. In Numbers 14:17 it says, "And now I beseech thee, let the power of the Lord be great, according to thou hast spoken. The Lord is long-suffering and of great mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, and by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, upon the third and fourth generation." So what is he saying here? There are consequences, if you do certain things, If I smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day and drink a bottle of bourbon every night, there's going to be consequences, He can forgive, but there's going to be consequences, and that's what he's saying. "Pardon, I beseech thee, the iniquity of this people." So he's always willing to pardon us. "According to the greatness of thy mercy, as thou hast forgiven this people from Egypt, even until now." So we see that the call for my people, that is God's people, is to each and every one of us. We're to do that. 2 points in closing. The nations of this world will crumble and fail. No question about that. Jesus' kingdom will come and be forever. If we are faithful to God, we will be a light to the world. So it's a responsibility that each and every one of us has, you know, that we need to be a positive influence. Well, we're out of time. I have time for if there's one more minute of comment. Okay. Thank you all for being here. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, again, as we study the lesson and we study the nations of the world and we see the consequences of what happens when we do not follow your plan, may we, like Israel was supposed to be a light. May we be a positive influence on others that we come in contact, not through anything we can do on our own, but through the power of the Holy Spirit living in us. For we ask these things in your name. Amen. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for being here this morning, and hope you enjoyed the Sabbath school. There'll be a service for those viewing online. There's a service following this one in about a half an hour, and encourage you to watch online if you can't be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, thank you.